Hello, welcome to The Shift, Mondoweiss's place to talk Palestine and U.S. politics. I am Adam Horowitz, Mondoweiss's managing editor, and on today's show, we will be talking about how the Israel smear campaigns are no longer working, and there were two stories this week that made that clear. But first, let me introduce my co-host here on The Shift, Michael Aria, Mondoweiss's U.S. correspondent. Hey, Michael.
Hi, Adam. How you doing?
Doing pretty good. Michael is the author of our weekly politics newsletter, The Shift, which, if you're interested in the topics we're talking about today, sign up for that. The link will be in the notes to the show. And also, before we get into the conversation, Mondoweiss is engaged in our summer fundraising drive. Everything we do at Mondoweiss is free to access. There are no paywalls, but a few times a year, we do ask our viewers, our listeners, and our readers to help support this work. So if you appreciate conversations like today, talking about the role of Israel in U.S. politics, please support our work, support our summer fundraising drive. There will be a link in the notes as well. So, Michael, we have some kind of big breaking news to talk about. It's not really breaking anymore, but last night, Tuesday night, there was yet another primary. We are recording this on June 3rd. On June 2nd, New Jersey went to the polls, and there was one race there that we'd really been following in New Jersey's 12th district, where Dr. Adam Hamawy was running for office. People might remember Dr. Hamawy is a surgeon who had volunteered to serve in Gaza during the genocide, and he came home from having witnessed the genocide, and that's what inspired him to run for office. You interviewed him a month ago. Tell us what happened last night and tell us about your interview with him and what you had learned about him.
Sure. Well, like you said, Dr. Adam Hamawy, he was running in the 12th district in Jersey. This is a very blue district, so the winner of this is expected to kind of easily prevail in the general election in November. This is one of these cases where we had a retiring and longtime incumbent in Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman. Has been kind of one of the more, I think, progressive members of the House, actually. So this is one of these races where we saw the same thing in Pennsylvania recently with the retirement of Dwight Evans, but where a bunch of candidates, even more candidates in that race, I think there was over 10 candidates in this race, and Hamawy actually raised the most money. I think one of the other parts of this story that kind of connects to our beat is I think we talked about this last week, actually, how we've been talking about, for years, pro-Israel groups have kind of been the only ones on the stage, so to speak, in Washington when it came to raising money or, creating PACs. And the idea of like a pro-Palestine PAC or a PAC that would oppose Israel in any way was kind of something I don't think that anybody could like conceive of like a decade ago. But a number of these have actually emerged. One of them is this newly launched, or fairly new now, launched super PAC called American Priorities, which is, specifically pro-Palestine. And they backed him in this race, and he raised quite a bit of money, and he prevailed. And like you said, we interviewed him early May, and at the time, I think there wasn't obviously much polling on this race, and it seemed a little unclear whether he had a great shot. But he did talk to me at the time about how he was an outsider. This is a guy who was a surgeon. He was actually also a combat vet, served at Iraq, and a surgeon. He was running on things beyond Palestine, Israel, of course. From the medical field, he was obviously very committed to things like Medicare for all. He's spoken up about ICE and Democrats being too not aggressive enough when it comes to abolishing ICE. So he kind of fits the mold when it comes to a lot of progressive issues, and he was able to prevail in this race. And he spoke to me, like I said, about how he volunteered in 2024 and 2025. And people may remember around that time where he was in Gaza, Israel had seized Rafah crossing, and there were a number of medical professionals, doctors and surgeons who were trapped with their colleagues. And he's one of the doctors who refused to leave until everyone was guaranteed safe passage out. So that made a lot of headlines at the time when it happened. So this is kind of a high profile. Um, he gained a certain level of profile for because of stories like that. But he centered that experience, and he obviously refers to what happens in Gaza as a genocide. And like you kind of alluded to there was an attempt to smear him. And we saw it from not just pro-Israel websites like the Jewish Insider, but we also saw it, I think, in mainstream publications like the New York Times, making a lot of hay about some alleged connections he had to Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who was a sheikh people may recall was tried by the U.S. government, ended up dying in jail, I believe, over connections to terrorists and terrorism. And as a young person, like in his 20s, he had attended some mosques where this guy had spoken, and then I think he was in a car with him, and he ended up supplying some testimony in his trial because there was a witness who eventually found out he had lied about a number of things, but he was an FBI informant, and he had claimed that the sheik had said something in the car, which I guess Hamawy hadn't heard. So he testified that he hadn't heard it. So anyway, this moment was kind of centered on by these pro-Israel groups and held up as an example, kind of like an old school war on terror era smear job. People remember these used to happen quite a bit. They're happening a little less now. I think that's kind of the theme of what we're going to talk about. But this idea that he was connected to terrorism or soft on terrorists or was directly connected to terrorism, which we hear thrown at Palestine advocates constantly. And I think the interesting and compelling thing is that these smears seemingly had no real impact. He won anyway, didn't make much hay. I think most voters kind of see through this kind of stuff. I think obviously this kind of smear doesn't work the way it did 20 years ago amid the height of the Iraq War and the occupation of Afghanistan and other interventions in the Middle East. One of the things that's changed, that's just a very obvious thing that's shifted, is there was a certain level of support among the majority of the U.S. population during that time for some of those wars. Whereas now, if you look at the polling on something like Trump's attacks on the U.S.-Israel bombings of Iran, it's gone in completely the opposite direction. A majority of the U.S. population oppose it. And of course, what we talk about every week here in the Shift podcast is how there's obviously these vast shifts when it comes to Israel compared to 5-10 years ago, and that the average, I think, U.S. voter is much more, much more skeptical of Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship, but also just much more deeply aware, I think, of a group like AIPAC and how they operate and what they do. There was a period of time when it was said like you couldn't organize around stuff like this. You couldn't bring up something like Zionism, for instance, because the average American didn't really understand what it was and they couldn't figure it out. I think that's completely changed, and I think through the work, obviously, of organizing principally by Palestinians themselves, but also independent media like Mondoweiss and others, and just the what has happened with the U.S.-Israel relationship in terms of there's a lot of stuff that the U.S. media, the mainstream media, has to cover. I mean, there's no way to avoid it. AIPAC is now factoring into virtually every primary we cover at the site in one way or another, or the issue of Gaza or Israel ends up factoring in. So I thought that was very interesting that the smears, despite the smears, they kind of went nowhere. And I think the smears kind of continue. Like the headline today in the New York Times after he won, the subtitle, I don't have it in front of me, but it was basically something to the effect of, he won despite facing questions about terrorism connections or something to that effect. And he really didn't face questions about this. This was just like a blatant bad faith campaign launched by pro-Israel groups and groups attempting to, quash his campaign before he got off the ground. We saw similar things. Jewish Insider, who I mentioned, had a pretty, I thought, hilarious headline. Despite past terror ties, Hamawy prevails with narrow plurality in New Jersey Democratic primary. This whole article is just like a big batch of cope, where they kind of, they're just talking about like, well, he prevailed in an area where this is his opponents. He prevailed over his opponents with regional bases, but limited support outside their local communities. This is that article referring to pro-Palestine views. They're saying basically pro-Palestine views are views that are critical of Israel are limited to these regional bases, like this district in New Jersey, the 12th district in New Jersey. But of course, this is nonsense, because this is not the only race, like I just said, where Israel or Palestine is factoring in. It's happening in virtually every race, and everybody knows, for instance, that the Democratic that the race for the Democratic nominee for the 2028 election, this is going to factor in. We've already seen, candidates position themselves, people like Rahm Emanuel or AOC, shifting their positions in some capacity, rhetorically at least, because they foresee this becoming a potential issue. We've already seen the debate around the autopsy coming out of the Harris campaign, where the genocide almost definitely impacted her loss, her inability to separate herself from the Biden policy. The smear campaign didn't work, and I think a lot of that stuff, even the analysis of it now from pro-Israel websites and the mainstream media, is still operating in a lot of bad faith. But to me, I think there's a lot of topics in this race that connect to things that we talk about here every week, and that's a couple of the big ones. I think just the fact that a pro-Palestine candidate can win, it's not like a huge, it just happens now. It wasn't a hindrance. If anything, it helped him, I think. And the fact that the attempts to draw attention to his positions on this issue just completely backfired, and none of the smears worked at all.
Yeah, no, 100%. And just to say, you did a great job at describing that smear campaign. Exactly right. There was also money behind that campaign too. There was an infusion of, again, we've been tracking this here, AIPAC still trying to impact elections, also understand that they are too toxic to do it frontally or publicly. But in the last week of this campaign, over $400,000 was injected in anti-Hamawy ads through one of these AIPAC shell groups to push these smears, and it still didn't work. And just to say, last night in his acceptance speech after he was declared winner, he said this as part of the speech, and I'm going to quote him. He said, "Let me be absolutely clear with y'all and everyone watching today. There was once a time when this may have worked, when racist and anti-Muslim attacks could swing an election. That era of American politics is over." So the smears themselves became part of the campaign, became part of the story, and they went absolutely nowhere. This was more money that AIPAC flushed down the toilet in New Jersey, especially. But I'm wondering if you agree with him that that era of American politics is over. We're now seeing. I mean, there were similar attacks against Chris Robb in Philadelphia. He won. Are we truly in a post-Israel lobby smear world?
I mean, I think people of a certain age who are watching this probably can pick off the top of their head their favorite example of a Congress member being ousted after they were targeted for by pro-Israel groups. I mean, it's happened for decades. I do think that kind of old school campaign, the campaign where you say this person is anti-Israel, it's just not going to work that way anymore, because it's not going to land, because the reality is that is a message that is greeted by most voters, or at least Democratic and independent ones still, and young Republican ones, see that as a positive message. If someone's critical of Israel, that's not a smear. That's not something that's going to lessen your chance of voting for them. It's probably something that's going to heighten it, right? And the wider context of that is just the U.S. Population completely shifting, I think, on the concept of what's referred to as like the forever wars, right? I mean, these polls about the attacks on Iran, for instance, and Trump's declining popularity, which is probably going to do massive damage to the Republicans in the midterms. That's kind of the wider, like the bigger picture outside of like our one beat. I think that stuff has completely shifted. I don't think you can smear people anymore by saying this person's like a terror sympathizer because they oppose the war, which that stuff was just happening so constantly in the mid 2000s. It's you could write an entire book about it. So I think that part of it is over. I think the Mamdani win over Cuomo was a huge threshold moment too, where he obviously leaned into his pro-Palestine stances. Cuomo leaned the opposite direction. The exit polling shows not that it hurt, not only that it didn't hurt Mamdani to be pro-Palestine, but it helped him. And with Cuomo, it's the opposite. Being pro-Israel absolutely hurt him at the polls, right? So that has shifted. I think what we're not living in a different era of politics insofar as the U.S. Israel relationship is still ironclad, and the Israel lobby is still very powerful. It still has a lot of money. It still is going to spend millions of dollars on the races it cares about. I do think it's going to be more difficult for them. We've seen AIPAC having to use these shell groups, shell packs with ostensibly liberal sounding names in order to funnel money into races where they can't put their name on it because they've become so toxic. But I think this has really become like a big game of whack-a-mole, right? Where it's like every time they spend 17, 18, 19 million dollars to stomp out a candidate, some other pro-Palestine candidate emerges in some other district, and maybe they got that one. It's like, that night a few weeks ago or a month ago where it's like they were able to, beat Thomas Massie in the most expensive House race ever. But Chris Rabb is going to Congress. So it's like every time they kind of like seemingly go all in and beat somebody, they can't beat somebody else. So I think those groups aren't going away. Pro-Israel forces, as we know them, aren't going away. But their jobs have gotten harder. And I think the way that they go about smearing candidates or attempt to bring them down, it itself will have to shift as we go forward.
In as much as when the history of this era and the end of that era is written, you already raised this, but I really do think that Cuomo-Mamdani race is going to be the beginning of the end, or sort of the hinge at which this all changed. Because one of the parts about that was just so great was that Cuomo thought he had this ace up his sleeve in terms of attacking Mamdani on his, pro-Israel bona fides, and really what he was doing was helping Mamdani every time he brought that up. I mean, it allowed Mamdani to talk about his feelings around Israel, which was not what he was running on at all. He had a whole other agenda, but Cuomo kept bringing it up and helping Mamdani every time he did it. And I think we're seeing that same thing play out in all these other races, which it's just so funny that you've already referenced like this kind of pro-Israel response to this New Jersey election last night. And it really feels like it boils down to this tantrum of like, why isn't this working anymore? We have the money, we have this sort of smear campaign, and yet these candidates who never used to win are now winning. Yeah, it's kind of fun to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, like, and like you referenced Como, it almost seemed like he was, like cryogenically like frozen and like thawed out. Like when you hear that type of rhetoric, I was like, whenever the Clintons say something, it's like you go in a time warp. It's like 1995. Like people are saying two-state solution, like the Palestinians never miss a chance to miss a chance, whatever that stupid line is. You know what I mean? It's like always that type of stuff. And that was the same thing with Biden. I thought throughout the genocide, he was just playing it the way that he thought to play it from like 1997, where it's like, look, Netanyahu's a friend of mine. I'm going to tell him what I think because we disagree. And he thought that would like and people were like, there's a genocide happening. And it was the same thing with Harris, I think, to an extent. That type of stuff just doesn't work anymore. And it just doesn't resonate. And when you see it, it's just such a throwback. We're seeing centrist lawmakers in real time have to shift that rhetoric, even if they are not shifting like their policy goals. And even if they're still pro-Israel, they're still having to do it like on the fly, change the way they're talking about things. And we saw that, not to go off on a tangent, but people may have seen that op-ed the other day from Van Hollen, for instance, where he alluded to the fact, this is a prominent mainstream senator, alluded to the fact that maybe if things don't work out, we should look at a one-state solution. And, the Senate is a very conservative place. So to see that in those type of places, or at least that rhetoric, I think it speaks to like all the things that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, because some people might not be familiar with this, but this was an op-ed that Chris Van Hollen wrote in the New York Times, and it was around primarily, if I remember correctly, around the question of aid to Israel and that it should be reconsidered, or I don't know if he was even calling for it to be ended, but there was this element in it where he was like kind of, and it just seemed so weird and antiquated as you read the article, because he held up like, of course we're trying to accomplish a two-state solution, and I was just like, wow, like for someone like, one of the things we've been talking about here is how quickly this discourse is shifting and how quickly like this Overton window on Israel and aid and Zionism is happening in real time. And I can imagine that Chris Van Hollen and his team thought that this was going to be like a forward-looking, like agenda setting kind of op-ed. And in many ways, it felt behind the times for, Chris Rabb is talking about the right of return and just won his election. Adam Hamawy is talking about genocide in Gaza and just won this election. And here Chris Van Hollen's talking about the two-state solution. Like it just felt completely irrelevant in a lot of ways, even though like it was also around ending aid to Israel, which again used to be this third rail issue and now almost feels like it's a little taken for granted in this kind of Democratic Party space where things are shifting so quickly.
Yeah, I think we talked about it on an editorial meeting we had, and I think you said that the op-ed felt like it was written in 2023 or 2024. Like it just felt like 2 years behind the times, and it's yeah, it's just funny to still reference a two-state solution where you're looking at this polling that says 60% of Democrats view Israel negatively, or 50% of independents, or the majority of Republicans ages 18 to 34, and you're watching people like Tucker Carlson who are associated with the right, make these comments about Israel. Israel is just like, I don't. To your point, I don't think like the two-state solution, fallback default, which people would just like pivot to all the time. People see through that, and I think these recent elections prove that people see through that. And I think going forward, we have a bunch of big elections coming up, including New York at the end of this month. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of people see through that.
All right, we're going to pivot to New York in 1 second, but before we do that, I just want to put in another reminder. If you enjoy conversations like this, if you appreciate topics like this, please both sign up for the Shift email newsletter. It comes out every week on Thursday. Michael will send it to you himself. And please support Mondoweiss and our summer fundraising drive. It's what makes all of our work possible. It makes conversations like this possible. So please, if you have any ability to do so, support Mondoweiss. All right, so shifting to New York, I said at the beginning that there were two stories this week that showed that the pro-Israel smears of the past are no longer working. And the other one of these stories marched right down Fifth Avenue through Manhattan. Of course, it was the Israel Day parade last Sunday, and New York Mayor Mamdani had announced a long time ago that he was not going to participate in this parade. He had been getting attacked for weeks by pro-Israel commentators, by pro-Israel politicians, both on the Republicans and Democrats, who claimed that this Israel Day parade. I mean, just to say, Mamdani said the reason he was not going to march in this parade is because it was in support of a government that is carrying out genocide in Gaza, is ethnically cleansing the West Bank. And people said, that's crazy. This parade is about Jewish culture and something. And then, of course, Mamdani was proven right this Sunday when some of the furthest right-wing figures of the current Israeli government not only marched in the parade, but were given a place of honor. And a number of people who were attacking Mamdani had to eat a bit of crow. And of course, Mamdani's position on this parade hurt him in no way politically. Again, he was the first New York City mayor to refuse to march in this parade. This was viewed as not even a question in the past, and that it would be considered political suicide to not participate. Not only did he not participate, but he was really, in the end, proven right and justified in not doing so. Again, another one of these signs about how the pro-Israel politics of the past kind of no longer exist. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I agree. Well, first of all, it's funny that people were making the argument that the Israel parade wasn't about Israel.
Yeah.
And secondly, he was the first mayor to not attend this thing, and nothing happened. And it's just, a few days later, and then, like nothing fell apart. The third rail, as I've, said before, this stuff was regarded as a third rail. That rail, like, really no longer exists. Like, this is not, career suicide. It means nothing. The people who hate Mamdani still hate him. His progressive supporters still support him. And just like New York City trudges on, the policies continue. But like you said, I mean, the funny thing now is that these people, these, Democratic, I don't know, like liberal Zionist centrists, New York lawmakers who participated in this thing are now having to distance themselves from it in some capacity. Like, oh, I was marching for Israel, but I didn't know there'd be a delegation of far right.
But I didn't know Israelis were going to be there.
know there were going to be members of the government, not who I disagree with, but also we must march in support of the foreign country. But I mean, chief among those is Smotrich, the nation's or Israel's minister, who was obviously just like a genocidal, racist person. People know, I mean, it's well documented, like on our website, but is incredibly hateful and racist towards Palestinians and bigoted against LGBTQ people and Reform Jews. And this guy's just marching in the parade. Just so for people to say, "Oh, this
at the front of the parade."
Just a celebration of Jewish culture, and it's not. It doesn't necessarily mean you agree with Netanyahu's policies and all. I mean, like, they have these like genocidal maniacs. People probably saw Smotrich recently, like within the last couple weeks, like tormenting and seemingly like abusing and like attacking and berating prisoners from like one of those flotillas, like these people that they dragged off the boat and held in terrible conditions. And there's been accusations of like attacks and sexual assaults and stuff. And these people are have blindfolds on, they're tied behind their backs, and this guy's yelling at them. I mean, this guy's in the front, like you say, at the front of the parade, and everybody's cheering him on and waving these little flags. And somehow it's the mayor is getting criticized for not participating in it. And it's just another one of these things that it's not going to land at all. Cause like, just look at the optics.
Right. But also, funny enough, so that was the lead up to the parade, he was getting attacked. But in this aftermath of the parade, it's actually the people that participated in it and defended the parade that are like facing the backlash. I mean, we were talking about New York Times headlines before. I thought their headline from this story was great, which was right-wing officials' appearance at Israel Day parade leads to backlash. It's the people that are actually on the defensive now and are having to answer the questions are the people who supported the parade, which again is another one of these signs of just like how the discourse has shifted and how this kind of, again, what was kind of considered this kind of pro-Israel common sense politically just no longer exists.
Yeah, can I just read this hilarious quote from Governor Kathy Hochul, who
please
participated? So she says, like, this is the defensiveness or the attempt to backtrack that you're referring to. Smotrich is a far right extremist whose hateful and divisive rhetoric is fundamentally at odds with the values we hold dear in New York. Yesterday's parade was a celebration of Jewish pride, community, and unity. I strongly condemn his participation. These people are, marching in the same parade as this guy, and then they have to say like, "Oh, that's actually not what I meant. I didn't know.
100%.
I thought we were celebrating the genocidal state. I didn't know the general."
This was a white pride march. Why were there Nazis there?
I was not told about it. I did not know there would be the torches, the flaming torches.
Exactly. Yeah. No. I mean, it's very funny. It's like, yeah. It's a pro-Israel parade. What were Israeli leaders doing, being there? Yeah. Oh my God. So. Yeah, things are changing.
Things are changing. Yeah, I think so.
Another week, two more signs. And you already alluded to this. I think this will be a conversation for probably our next discussion, but New York is up next on the primary list. It's happening, I think, in 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. You just did a great interview with Peter Feld, who's a political strategist in New York, talking about how Palestine's playing out in these races. We'll be sure to include a link to that in the show notes here, but maybe that we could check in again in 2 weeks, see how those elections are coming together and how Palestine's playing out in New York politics as New Yorkers go to the polls.
Yeah, 100%. I think they call it a tease in the industry. I would just encourage people to go check out Peter Feld, who is a political consultant who we turn to a lot, who's extremely tuned in when it comes to democratic politics and also this issue. And he breaks down not just a number of races, but the recent Park Slope co-op vote where they finally approved a boycott of Israeli goods, and AOC, who's obviously a New York politician, who has presidential aspirations. So it's a great piece to visit at the site if you kind of want a rundown going into that. It's June 23rd. So if you want to kind of get prepared, little explainer piece going into those races, what you should be looking out for. I'd recommend.
Excellent. I like this. I like that homework before the next shift discussion.
Well, and if you're there, if you're reading that piece and, learning about those races and why Richie Torres has the lead despite his views, etc., you can also click to donate amid our fundraiser. So it's like a one-stop shop. You can do all these things right in front of you. Click of a mouse, as they say.
Michael, you're smooth. All right. Well, thank you. Good conversation. Look forward to the next one. I will talk to you soon.
Great. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Michael.